How's it going, everyone? Bryce Newberger here with the Soul Ward, and we're joined once again by Nova, who we had a fantastic interview with regarding just cults and getting out of cults and the kind of the brainwashing process and her own personal story of getting involved with a cult to getting out of a cult. And so we had a great talk with her, and she brought up a lot of terminology that was unique to us. And in that podcast, we were really just taking a look at her journey into and out of a cult, but she had so much interesting things to say about her journey and learning things, what was called shadow work. And so I wanted to have her back to take a look at her personal worldview as it is and the shadow work. So Nova, thank you so much for joining me today.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you for coming back. And so you had we were talking a little bit before we started recording, and she mentioned a podcast that is probably going to be a more comprehensive look at this. And again, as a reminder for people out there for the Soul Ward, is no one here professes to be an expert on their belief system. They're merely an expert on what they believe. So Nova, she's not going to claim to be an expert or a teacher or a guru of the shadow work. She's an expert on Nova. She's an expert on herself, and we're just going to hear her story. We're going to hear what she likes about this worldview, and we're going to take some time to understand Nova a little bit better as we go through this. So I'll link that better, that she was saying it might be a better, more comprehensive, though it's kind of long of a podcast. It's an hour and 20 minutes and 12 seconds. But for those, it's a series. Okay.
Yeah.
But it starts with individuation, the shadow, and she sent me the link. I will post that link in the description of this video when it posts on YouTube. For the meantime, though, Nova, why don't you give us just a little bit of a introduction to shadow work? What does that term mean? Where does it come from? And what does it mean to you?
The term shadow work. Carl Jung actually has a term where basically to describe this feeling of anything that you don't accept of yourself is called your shadow. The things you don't want to look at, the things that you reject in yourself, the things that you cannot love unconditionally, that is like your shadow. So a way to see it better is like our real self is our light, but then the things that we reject in ourselves that are who we are, but we reject it and we hate it and we become like embarrassed of it or ashamed of it, that's like the shadow our light is casting in a way. So instead of like us being the light, we're like living in our shadow. We're living in our fears. Instead of living our dreams, that being our light, we're living in our fears. So like our shadow is it's kind of unconscious. We're not always like aware of things in our shadow because you know typically the shadow happens when you're really young and you try to express yourself a certain way, but then other people, they might bully you or they will judge you and they'll make you not like certain aspects of yourself. So then what ends up happening is that you're not being who you are, you're being what other people tell you to be. You're being uh you know a way for you to like be more accepted by other people but less accepting of yourself. So that would be what your shadow is. Now Carl Jung, he calls it the shadow. I don't know where the term shadow work came from, but it's basically working on your shadow, like figuring out what happened that to you, that you decided that you couldn't love this part of you, you couldn't accept this part of you, and things like that. Now the thing about that is that while we live in our shadow, we kind of have this persona, this person that we pretend to be, but we are not consciously thinking to ourselves, okay, I'm going to pretend to be someone I'm not. Like it's not a conscious thing. It's very, very subtle that we don't realize that we are changing ourselves to what other people want us to be, and we're being less of who we actually are. And actually over time it actually creates a lot of suffering because you're not being who you are, you're never going to be happy. If you're trying to be what other people want you to be, of course you're not going to be happy, you're going to be miserable because you're not being who you are. And the funny thing is that we've done this subconsciously because we think that if I just become somebody else, then I'll be happier, then I won't have to deal with all these problems. But the reality is that over time you're going to have to pay the piper. Over time, it's going to catch up to you, and you cannot pretend to be somebody that you're not. And this is, at least for me, this manifested like my depression, my social anxiety, caring what other people think, and like I don't know what it is I want because I don't know who I am. Because I started to realize like, wait, all these things are like what other people want, but I don't even know what I want. All I know is what I don't want, but I don't even know like who I am yet. So just like when I was like coming out of the cult, I was like trying to reinvent myself, trying to figure out, okay, who am I? Who am I really? Without the cult telling me what I should be, what I should do, what I should believe, how I should dress, things like that. I get to figure out that for myself, right? But in order for me to find myself, I had to look into my shadow, and I had to learn to love myself unconditionally. I love those parts of me unconditionally.
Yeah. So it seems like there's a real focus on authenticity there, being authentic to
Definitely.
yourself.
Yes.
And so, if I'm hearing correctly, too, you're saying that the fallout, the damage done if you are not authentic to yourself, if you don't love what you would call probably your shadow self,
Hmm.
is that you said it was causing anxiety, it can cause depression. Is that, do you think that's one of the primary risks of it?
Yes, I think that's one of the primary risks because, like, if you're not being authentic, like, everything around you is inauthentic
Mm.
because like if you're being your inauthentic self, and like you have like a friend or whatever, that friend, version of you that's inauthentic, but you present it as your authenticity. You think that it's who you are, and these other people think that's who you are, but it's actually not you. There's also like because here's the thing, this is like the hardest thing ever, because as you become more of who you are, all the things around you that were attracted to your inauthenticity, or a part of your life, that these decisions you made because of your inauthenticity, that has to come off. So the more you become authentic, you might have less friends, or you might have to end a relationship, or things like that. And that's why it's very hard, because not only do we put ourselves in a box of who we can and cannot be, other people kind of do that to us as well, based upon that they think they know who we are, but we don't even know who we are. So it's like sometimes, like when you change, like people will get upset that you changed, like you're not allowed to change, you know. But it's like you actually are. And if the change is for your authentic self, you actually don't lose anything. You actually become more of what you already are. It just seems like you're losing things, and it can hurt a lot. But at the end of the day, it's like you're becoming closer to your ultimate happiness, because you're being real and you're being authentic. And when you do that, you have more people that are also real and authentic, and the more you become real and authentic, it's easy to see in others who are not being authentic to themselves.
And so there's a freedom in authenticity, is kind of what I'm
It,
hearing.
yeah, but it can be painful too, but it's a good pain. Like shadow work, it's the scariest thing you're ever going to do, but it's the biggest payoff you're ever going to get in your life.
Yeah, what makes it so? Now I can imagine, but I don't want to assume anything, right? So
Okay.
what makes it so painful or scary?
Okay, so basically, what you learn in shadow work is the ego, right? So we have like a healthy ego and we have an unhealthy ego. Most people have an unhealthy ego where like they inflate themselves, where they think that they're better than everyone else, or they think that they're better than they actually are. And then there's people who have a deflated ego, which is more what I had, is when you think really, really less of yourself, you undermine yourself, you don't give yourself enough credit, you're constantly comparing yourself to other people, you think you're not enough, and you don't see your potential. Whereas in the opposite way, when you inflate yourself, you think like you're this whole, like you think you're a king, you think you're better than everyone, you think so highly of yourself, but it's actually not rooted in reality. If you think you're better than other people, you don't know yourself. If you think you're worthless, you don't know who you are. So like to have like a healthier ego would actually be a weakening of the unhealthy ego. So you're like more in the middle, where you have like a balanced position where you know who you are, you know your potential, you're accepting those parts of you, but you're not putting yourself down and you're not putting yourself at a pedestal at the same time. So that was explaining ego. So the thing is that's scary is that we hold on to this fake idea of ourselves because we don't know who our real self is. So ego is like where our identity comes from, right? So all fear comes from ego, right? So so since ego is identity, whenever we lose identity, that's where fear comes in. For instance, if you identify as being shy, the scariest thing for you is to not be shy. If you're a parent and you identify as being a parent, the scariest thing for you is to lose your child and not be a parent anymore. Or maybe you realize that you haven't been a good parent. Like for me, being in the cult, identifying as a Mormon, the scariest thing for me was to not be Mormon. You know what I mean? So, like, basically, the root of all fear comes from our ego. This is why it's the scariest thing you're ever going to have to do. But it brings you closer to who you are in the end. But it is terrifying. It is terrifying.
So would you say that what the work of shadow work is to eradicate the ego as much as possible,
Yeah, pretty
whether
much.
inflated or deflated?
Yeah, you gotta eradicate the ego like as much as possible, but also at the same time, like not to judge ego as well. Because and that's another thing is because not only is there like fear involved with the ego, but there's also judgment, right? So in shadow work, we talk about like shadow projection, where basically what you judge in someone else is what you judge in yourself. And I've seen this a lot. Where like people will judge people for being judgmental when it's like you're doing the same thing as they're doing. You know what I mean? You're judging someone else's judgment. um you know but basically whenever you're judging something, and this goes back to non-duality and understanding duality, is that in order for you to judge something, you have to identify it, going back to ego and identity, you have to identify it as something that is other than yourself. Because why would you judge something knowing that it is you? It's easier to judge when you separate and divide from the thing that you're judging, right? So, like, like in cults, they like to create the other, the group of others, so that way you can judge the other, right? But that's the thing, is that you're actually judging yourself when you're judging the other. And that's really important in cults. But also, as I mentioned, in cults, like a cult is just a really high functioning ego. It's just like it's like a bigger reflection of the ego, because cults are like the most like egotistical thing ever, because they're super closed minded. They want to keep you stuck in the paradigm. They make you afraid of looking at other things. And that's what I'm talking about, is like they make you afraid of looking at other perspectives, being who you actually are. They want you to judge the other, so that way you can judge them as bad and think of yourself as good, right? And the more you identify with that, and the heavier you identify with it, the bigger your fear is going to become, and the harder it is to love unconditionally.
Yeah.
Because, like, yeah, how can you love something that you've judged your whole life? It's like it's really hard.
It's very interesting as you're talking. My mind automatically goes to the teachings of Jesus, because it seems like he was very. That's something that I've referred to as the madness of Christianity at times, where it's like, Jesus will teach that you're beautifully and wonderfully made. You're an amazing work of creation. You're also a sinner, and you need saving. And so there's this like, and so how do you reconcile those two? Well, you're supposed to meet in the middle, and to not judge others. And so it's really interesting, almost the overlap in the belief system here. Now, when you talk about all fear comes from ego, and that's something that you just went into. What are you went into a few examples of fears that come from ego, as in like you are, and I just want to contextualize to make sure that I'm hearing this correctly. So you're saying someone who has ego in being a parent. You're a parent. And so a fear then is losing your child or your right to parent, the CPS taking them away or the child dying, right? And that's a major source of fear. And so that would build ego. Am I hearing that correctly?
Um, It wouldn't build ego. Like the identity is what builds ego,
Mm.
and losing that identity is what loses the ego, if that makes sense. I know it can be kind of confusing.
Yeah.
But like, so like ego is identity. The more identity you have, the more ego you have. The less identity you have, the less ego you have. All right. So like with the more ego you have, you have more judgmentalism. You think things in black and white. You either inflate yourself or you deflate yourself. And it's harder for you to change. It's easier for you to judge, and it, and like you'll have like a lot of projection in your life where you'll like judge other people or judge other things. So like when you have less ego, that basically means that you judge less, right? So when you judge less, that opens the gateway for real gratitude and real unconditional love. So you become more loving, you become more authentic, you're not judging, so you're loving, and you're loving of yourself and you're loving of other people, and it gives you a better awareness about the world around you, because now you're observing the world instead of projecting what you think it is. So like you have a healthier sense of yourself, other people, and the world around you, and you just have like overall like a more open mind.
Okay. All right. And so when it comes to the authentic self, right?
Hmm.
And there's a few terms here that we're building to kind of work with as a working dictionary for this conversation. We have ego, we have identity, and we have authentic self, right? Or
Hmm.
authenticity. Um, is there a difference between between let's say identity and authenticity? Like, can you find your identity in your authentic self?
No, this is a really cool thing that you mentioned this, because like when we learned in non-duality, like things that are like seemingly opposite kind of chase each other like a circle, like a yin and yang. So here's the thing that I kind of brushed upon it a little bit, but basically when you realize that you're being something that you're not, that you have an identity, uh eventually that identity, it's like you got to pay the piper, because you're not going to be happy being someone that you're not, right? And you're going to realize something is wrong. You may not identify it as identity, you might not identify it as ego, but you're going to start manifesting like you're going to be really uncomfortable with yourself. You're not going to know what you want. You're going to be too worried about what other people think, and you may not know why, at the time. But when you don't know what you want, but you realize what you don't want, right? So then what ends up happening is that you have to go outside your comfort zone. This is so what you're comfortable with is also tied to like your ego, because like your ego wants things like to be easy. You don't want to do things that are too scary. You don't want to do things that are unfamiliar. That's like the darkness, that would be like the shadow. And it's a lot easier to be in something that is familiar but damaging to us than something that is unfamiliar but can help us. So it's like the ego doesn't really want us to change. The ego wants you to stay the same, right? So like when you're doing shadow work, you got to go outside your comfort zone. You got to do something that you never thought you were going to do. You're going to have to do things other people aren't going to like. You're going to have to do things that are very uncertain, that you kind of have to figure out on your own. Like when you have identity, or when you're in a cult, like they tell you who you are, they tell you what you want. They things like that, like it's all laid out in front of you. But when you're doing shadow work, you're literally taking the giant leap of faith, and trying to do something that you never thought you'd do. And the thing is like it's got to be really bad for you in order to move into something that is really scary. Like the way I saw it, it's like, going outside of my comfort zone, doing things I don't really want to do or that I'm scared to do. And it's not really that I don't want to, it's because I'm scared to do them. And the only reason why I seem like I don't want to is because my ego is making me afraid, you know because I don't know my authentic self yet. And so behind fright, there is light. And that's a common thing that's like that I repeat a lot in shadow work. But basically, you're uncomfortable now and it's scary now, but it cannot possibly be as bad as what you're trying to go into, because it's got to be really bad in order for you to change. That's how people change. Like if you think you're doing good and you're having a good life, you don't think anything's wrong with you. You're not going to change. But it's not until like shit hits the fan and everything is going bad, and like that you realize, okay, I need to change. I don't know where to go. I don't know what to do, but I'm going to do something. So like when you figure out that what you identify with now isn't working for you, you have to shed that away, and that's how you become your authentic self. But you need to know that who you were isn't who you actually are, and you don't know who you are, you don't know what you want, you just know what you don't want. And that helps you solidify your authentic self. Like, you're not going to know firsthand what you are, you just know what you aren't and what you don't want. And that kind of helps you realize, okay, I know what I want based upon what I don't want. If that makes sense. It's kind of like a weird loop. It's like a weird cycle.
Yeah, I'm listening here and I'm processing some things. And when you talk about you never know what you want, but you know what you don't want. I'm just thinking about like I can't help but just contextualize that for myself. And I think of things that my mind instantly goes, well, what's something that I want? And do I am I fighting that by what I don't want? Like case in point, when we sat down, I made myself a cup of coffee because I love coffee. What is it? Does it get that simple down to the choices? Like I think I want coffee, but are you saying that I don't really want this coffee? Like I just don't want to be without coffee, or I'm just trying to understand that better.
It has like more to do with like the way you're living your life, if that makes sense. Like with decisions, decisions can affect the way that we live. And like depending on what part of life you want to change, maybe that decision with your coffee would be, important, or maybe it won't, you know. Um, I don't know.
Sure. So what you're saying is it's more of an overarching thing. Case in point,
Yes.
um, I didn't want to lose my children, right?
Hmm.
Like I'm recently divorced. I didn't want to lose my marriage, so I worked really hard not to lose that.
Hmm.
So that would be more of an overarching thing.
Yes.
Now, could it work? So when it comes to like a bigger decision, then like I got married. Was it more of just I didn't want to be alone? Is that kind of where we're coming from?
It could pretend it could. You see, like a lot of times, like we can make decisions without knowing who we are or what we want, and that's totally okay because it takes a lot of character building to figure that out. Like when I had my identity and I was Mormon, I wanted to get married as soon as possible because that's what is taught in Mormonism. After you graduate, you serve a mission, you get married. But that was my inauthentic self. That was what I thought I wanted. That was my identity at that time. So it's not necessarily like a bad or a good thing. It's just whatever is serving you at that moment in time, then you go for it. Because otherwise you're just going to be waiting and waiting, you're not going to make any decisions. So like, you know when you go into, like I said, like when you go into shadow work, and like you might have like you will be your inauthentic self, you might lose your friends, you might break up in a relationship, you might have this or that happen, but it's breaking away like the old reality, and it really hurts. Um but like a lot of the times, like a decision that we made in the past could have been a shadow projection. It could have been because we had an identity, but it's not necessarily a bad thing because that's who you were at that time. That's what you wanted at that time. And I would rather, you do what you want, even if it is from ego, than doing something you obviously don't, because you can't be happy either way. But you won't realize it until like maybe sometime later when you do work on yourself, that you'll be like, oh, you know what? Maybe I need different friends, or maybe people think I'm this person, but that's not really who I am, and maybe they might not like that, or things like that. Like there's a lot of shedding away of the old life. Um and that's gonna hurt a lot. Like it's gonna hurt a lot. Like I've had that like happen to me, where like I had to like unfriend a bunch of people. Like I had to surround myself with like better people. There was even a time where like I was just by myself for a bit, and it can be scary sometimes. But yeah, like a lot of the decisions we made in the past, that might we might have to face that, or we might have to remedy that, or we might have to break it off, cut things off. um But in the end, it's like you have a new perspective and you don't want to live the old life. You can't live that way anymore, you know, because it's not who you are. So you have to deal with that. And that's why I'm saying like it goes deep and it cuts deep and it hurts a lot. It hurts a lot, like a lot of people, doing shadow work, like they might end up getting a divorce because they realize that, their spouse is like being mean to them or things like that, or like they're only with them, like it could be like a narcissistic relationship, and they realized, oh wait, I'm in this relationship because I don't feel like I could live without that person. That person has also become part of my identity, but I need to be who I really am because this person isn't helping me be who I am. Instead, it's just perpetuating who I think I am. And of course, like with the narcissistic abuse, they're telling you things like you're not good enough, no one's gonna love you like I do, no one's gonna want you, you're worthless, so just stay with me. Because no one else is gonna want you, even though like I'm hurting you and all these kinds of things. And but like it's one of the harder things that I myself, because I'm really young, I haven't made like life altering decisions like that where shadow work is going to like do that to me yet. Like the older people that do it, they have more of those life altering decisions, those hard decisions that they're going to have to make and things like that. But I'm still really young and I'm still like figuring things out, so I never had to face that. But it's definitely one of the harder things.
Yeah, yeah, and it definitely seems like a process very much focused on oneself, right? Shadow work is something you do for yourself to help yourself. How does it play with selflessness, like reaching out to others or unconditionally loving other people? How does that kind of play into this?
When you love yourself unconditionally, you love other people unconditionally. When we don't like in someone else is what we don't like in other people. Now it is subconscious, and not everyone realizes this at the time. Um, for instance, like how do I say this? Like there could be a person who doesn't like this one guy, but he's really confident, lots of people love him, but he hates him. But he hates him because he feels like he's not capable of love. He feels like he can't have confidence. So when he sees someone else who is, it triggers him. And this is where the shadow projection and the trigger comes in. It's like when something triggers you and you feel like uncomfortable, like, well, and you don't really know why. It's because subconsciously whatever it is that you're seeing or experiencing is making you realize that there are things about yourself that you do not like. But instead of you, realizing that, internalizing that for yourself, you think, oh, it's that person, that confident person over there who everyone loves. He's the problem. I'm not the problem. It's him, and I hate him. But really, it's just parts of you that you didn't love unconditionally that prevented you from having the confidence, that prevented you from expressing yourself and being your authentic self. And that's another thing is like people who are inauthentic aren't going to like authentic people, you know and it's sad, but that's kind of like what happens, like you kind of hear this a lot, like with like the bullies will like pick on the people that they kind of relate to, but they hate themselves for it. Like a bully might pick on a nerd because they're smart, but then that bully, when he was young, he was a nerd and he got bullied for it, so now he does it to other people because he thinks, oh, if I bully other people, no one can bully me. So that's the thing about like having the shadow, is like you put on this persona thinking that's going to protect you, but then you're going to have to face that. And then in a weird way you project on other people, so you actually don't protect yourself and you don't really heal yourself. Maybe you do in a little instance, and I can totally understand that because we all have to have some sort of ego. We have to have some sort of shadow because this world is hard, and at times when you're really young, it does make sense that we turn off our hearts, we turn off our authenticity, and we become, I don't want to say like a monster, but like when we start to project judgment, like the world is very hard, and sometimes we feel like we have to become more abrasive, we have to put a shell around who we really are in order to protect ourselves, because whatever environment we were in had taught us that we can't be ourselves, we can't love ourselves. I have to fight for my life, I have to judge other people so that way I won't be judged, and all these things. But the reality is that you don't actually fix the problem within you. So like how this ties into like unconditional love is just as within, so without, like as above, so below. So it's really all a reflection of you. That's all that it is. So when you love yourself unconditionally, it is so much easier to love other people unconditionally, because you're not putting conditions on your own self-love, and you're not putting that on other people. If you're not judging them, then you're loving them, and you're being grateful for them, and you're praising them, and that's because you're doing that to yourself. And like some people who have a deflated ego, what happens is that like they might put someone else like on a pedestal, and put themselves lower. You know what I mean? Because like they'll give someone else all the love they never gave themselves, and then they'll put that person up on a pedestal. And that's also kind of like what happens with codependent relationships, is like, you give the other person all the love you never gave yourself, and then it's just you're codependent because you don't have your own self-love, you don't have your own self-worth, you don't have your own self-esteem, you get it from someone else. So like whenever there's like breakups from codependent relationship, it hurts the most, because you just broke off your identity with another person. You have to figure out who you are, and it's super scary. You know what I mean? So that's like an example of like how that plays into like unconditional love and shadow projection, and like your triggers, and things like that.
Yeah, and that resonates very deeply with me, and I could see. Yeah, we had this saying when I was a youth pastor that we would say, hurt people," and I can just kind of almost see where that saying is almost explored deeper in this shadow work, because yeah, and that kind of goes back to kind of what you're talking about too, with cults being a superego and creating broad brush definitions of others. It's very interesting. It's very interesting. One interesting thing too is, as I studied Scientology, to speak about other cults, but it's interesting though, because part of Scientology is cleansing yourself of thetans. And no one ever made the joke when I learned about it was get behind me, Thetan. But anyways, but they cleanse themselves of thetans, and what thetans are a lot of these ego things that you're talking about. So although Scientology is a cult, you got to pay them thousands and thousands of dollars to cleanse your thetans, right? But if there's any Scientologists out there, maybe you should look at shadow work, and get out of a cult and do it where it's not going to cost you thousands of dollars to give to Scientology to cleanse yourself of these thetans, because that's kind of what it sounds like shadow work specializes in, is cleansing the ego, being your authentic self. It sounds like a great exercise to go through, and a lot of core truths that I'm hearing through there. And this is a lot of stuff that, as I got divorced, you're hitting me personally too, because like I was codependent on my wife in that she was my other half, as you call it. And we learned in marriage counseling, get rid of I, me statements and start saying we, our statements. And so, whereas I think that was a really good thing in a lot of ways to be a united front, that was very hard for me to lose my marriage and to go, okay, well, and to see that codependency in myself. So this looks like this could be very good work for everyone. I want to hit a few terms here. Last time we talked, you said the illusion of the ego. Now we've talked about ego. What would be the illusion of the ego?
So illusions is basically a perception that is not reality. But the thing is that your ego thinks that it's reality. For instance, duality, the idea of separation and division, illusion of the ego. Another example will be like someone who's stuck in a victim mentality will only see themselves as a victim, and they will not notice anything that is going good for them. They're not going to have any gratitude. They're always going to think, I'm a victim, bad things happen to me, even though there are some good things that are happening to them, even though there are people that love them, even though they're not really left out. But because they have this deep sense of uh I'm a victim, they will only see themselves as a victim. And that was one of the things that you go through in shadow work, because like that's a lower state of awareness to be in, because I was in that awareness, because I don't know if I mentioned it, but like even before, like I was in the cult, like I was bullied, you know and that kind of grew up my ego. My identity was like, oh, I was this bullied girl. I was in a cult, and like no one understood me. I was going through all these hard things I couldn't talk about. And that was like my life story. So another thing with the ego is like who we think we are versus who we actually are. Who we think we are is not who we actually are. That's an illusion of the ego. You have identity that feels real, but it is completely an illusion. But it's actually good that it's an illusion, because if it's an illusion, then that means all these bad things that you think you are, if it's an illusion, that means you can break free from the illusion. That means that it's not the end all be all. So if you have a sad story, that's not the story of who you are. You are actually more than that, and you're great than that, but you have to remove the illusion, because like let me tell you, like back then, like I have a YouTube channel now, but back then I couldn't even think about making a YouTube channel. I speak out more, and like I was not confident, like I was in a victim mentality. I was really depressed. Like I couldn't imagine that I'd be doing the things I'm doing now. Like I'm taking care of myself. Like, I got a job, but back in the day, like I couldn't even fathom what I'm going to do now, and that's because I thought I was this person that like couldn't be anything, or that I feel like I had pressure to become somebody, to become a somebody. But the reality was that I always was a somebody. I just thought I wasn't, because like when I was getting out of my cult, and I started to do apply some shadow work, I started to realize that I didn't really have self-worth. I didn't have self-confidence. I didn't have self-esteem. I didn't have self-compassion. I didn't have self-love, and I realized that a lot of this did come mostly from my cult, but also from being bullied, you know so like my illusion of myself was like based upon what I lacked and what I didn't have, and things like that. Um and it wasn't until like I realized, I redefined and really look into what is self-love, what is self-compassion, what is self-esteem, what is self-worth, that I started to realize, wait a second, I always had worth. I was always worthy, but I just thought that I wasn't. You know, like of course, like being in the cult, being told you're unworthy, being having these worthiness questions, and because like I was told I wasn't worthy, that made me think I was worthless. You know what I mean? So like
Yeah.
this is like a cult could also be like an abusive relationship. It's not just like with a cult, like people could have friends that like put them down, or they could be in toxic relationships that put them down and like make you think that you're something that you're not. So you think you're not confident, you think you don't love yourself, you think you're not worthy, you think you don't have self-esteem, but that is just your ego playing itself out, making you seem like you don't. But the reality is that you do. And you do when you break free from the illusion, but everything feels real. So like the illusion, it's a real illusion. Yes, if that makes sense. It's an illusion, but it's real. And even though it's an illusion, the emotions are real, the feelings are real, how you see yourself, that is real, but your perceptions are an illusion that is making these feelings, that is making this identity.
Yeah, this is something that postmodernism brings up as the idea that stories have power, right? So
Indeed.
if you believe a train is coming and you jump out of the way as if a train is coming, it doesn't matter if a train is coming or not. You reacted to it as if it was real. And so I could see where you say like the illusions, they're not real, but they are real. They're not real, but they can hurt you. And I would say that, yeah, I'm getting a little bit of that like yeah, if you live your life in such a way as if that were a truth,
Uh-huh.
then you're going to
Then
hurt yourself.
yeah, it's almost like it becomes true when you believe it's true. Like another example was like I had a fear of like what other people thought of me, and because I had social anxiety, right? So what ended up happening was that I don't know what other people think. I can't read their minds, but because in the past I was worried, what other people said to me, or what other people, said about me, things like that. I became afraid of what other people thought, because like I didn't have a good healthy sense of self. So that's another thing. If you don't know who you are, what other people say to you is going to hurt. But when you know who you are and you are your authentic self, it's say like you're really smart, and you're not insecure about being dumb, because you're smart. You built up the authenticity, you put in the work. If someone tells you you're dumb, you're probably just going to laugh at them. You know what I mean? Like, but like if you don't know who you are and you're insecure, if someone tells you something like that, you're going to feel like, oh my gosh, like, am I dumb? Am I stupid? Or things like that. So like because I couldn't tell what other people were thinking, but I was afraid of what other people were thinking, I was reacting as if everyone thought badly of me, or everyone was judging me, or judging, the way I looked, or the way I spoke, or whatever it is, or how I was doing in school, or things like that. So like the reality is that maybe people aren't really focused on me. Maybe lots of people are just focused on themselves. Like we can't always assume that everyone is paying attention to us. But of course, me being, bullied a lot, not wanting attention, the scariest thing for me is having any attention. So like when I get attention, it's always bad attention. So whenever, like I'm scared, to ask for help from other people, because I had, my teachers like groan when I ask for help, or like people get annoyed with me when I ask for help, or things like that. Or you know what I mean? And so like I was just like always in fear of like, oh, everyone's going to treat me this way. So the reality could be that maybe they're not thinking this at all, but because I'm assuming things and I'm scared of things happening over and over again, I'm feeling that effect even if it's not happening at all. So it's basically you're reliving trauma that may not actually be happening, but you keep on the loop. The loop keeps going. And you're living as if you're stuck in that loop, which only perpetuates it even more. That perpetuates your life story, that perpetuates your identity, and you have this whole thing wrapped up in like you're the victim mentality, caring too much what other people think. And that's a big thing in shadow work, because lots of people are very insecure, and they do care a lot what other people think. And that's why it's like really hard for my teachers who teach shadow work. They have to do things that other people aren't going to approve of. They have to say things that other people aren't going to like in the community, but it's true, you know and like if you are not doing anything that like isn't offending anyone, I mean, not like you're purposely trying to, but everyone's going to get offended no matter what you do. And this is where you learn, like, pleasing other people is never going to work out for you, because you can't please everyone. You can only please yourself. And if you try to be a people pleaser, if you care about too much what other people think, you're going to be living a life where other people are controlling you and you're not controlling yourself. You're always going to be insecure. You're always going to compare yourself to other people. You're always going to assume the worst in situations where even nothing may be happening or not, you know? And that also kind of
Yeah.
plays into like self sabotage as well.
Yeah. I mean, again, you're spitting so much things that I identify as truth as well. It's funny because in a lot of ways I would identify myself coming from an opposite experience of you. Obviously, being a male, and being a straight white male in American Western society, and being I public speak a lot, and I grew up very comfortable on a stage. But it's interesting, even so, a lot of the stuff you're saying rings so true to me, because even though I could be comfortable in front of a large crowd of people, I definitely identify with that insecurity and that wondering what other people think. And even a sense of confidence sometimes is found in what other people, hearing enough good input from other people instead of finding it in myself. And that kind of seems where your shadow work comes from, is letting that come from within instead of from without.
Yeah, you're not seeking validation from other people.
So instead
Lots of
of
people, yeah.
a lot of people said something negative, let me find a lot of good people to say something positive. It's like, no, find that within.
Yeah, it's a weird thing though, because like sometimes like you can be too identified with what negative people say that becomes everything, but then sometimes you become overly dependent on what good things other people say. You know what I mean? So it's like that in between, where it's like it's not bad if people agree with you and people like you, but you got to make sure you're not dependent on what other people say, whether it's good or bad, and making sure that you're secure from within. Because there's people that are like constantly, for instance, you may be always trying to make your dad proud or your mom proud and things like that, and like you like that, and that's good. But what about if you do something and you think you're going to make them proud, but then you don't make them proud? Instead, they say they're disappointed. You know what I mean? Like you're going to feel that, and you're going to get that insecurity. But if you have it from within, because that's what something I had to do. Because when I had to tell my dad that like I'm not Mormon anymore, like I had to feel secure of myself that despite if my dad agrees with me or not, I have to feel good from within, and that's the react. I've heard like horror stories of like people who are Mormon and they come out to their parents as being gay. And like I've heard stories where like this guy, he came out to his dad and his dad called him Judas, and or like things like that. And it was like really like, like, but that's the thing. It's like when I was doing that shadow work and I had to tell my dad, like I had to be honest with myself, I had to prepare myself, and I thought to myself, if he whether he agrees or not, whether he's supportive or not, I have to be supportive of myself, you know? But this was after a time where, like, I had to really face the reality that I cannot do this anymore. I cannot be living up to what other people want me to do. I have to stop. It's at a point where you kind of get fed up with it. Like you're kind of not like mad, but it's like you're so fed up with living in other people's, expectations that you start to realize, this is actually really bad. I don't want to do this anymore. So like, you know what? Like you're basically like fuck it. I'm just gonna do it. I'm just gonna take the leap of faith. If they don't like it, well then, fuck them. I'm doing what I want to do. And it's like the attitude of like that, just like whatever, I'm gonna wing it, I'm gonna take the leap of faith. They don't like it, well then they could back off, because like I'm on a roll, I'm taking charge of my life. So if you don't like it, too bad. This is how I'm gonna do things. And it's kind of like that sassiness, that attitude. It's like, you know what, you don't like me, well that's okay.
Yeah. Now, so follow up question on that too is there sometimes for a community to be built, or for community to thrive, or for the betterment of community, your authentic self might need to step aside. Would you say that is true, or would you say that it's always necessary to be authentic to yourself, um, even flying in the face of building a community?
um I think that it can happen. I don't know if there's like a better or a worse thing, because like to me the way I see it like holistically is like even in times where you're inauthentic, eventually you will learn to be authentic. But ultimately, like we talked about in shadow work, is that anytime you're being inauthentic, you're going to have to pay the bill. There's going to be a price to pay with that. If you're being inauthentic, and you would say you're like an influencer like in a community, and people find out you're going to be authentic, depending on how the community will receive you, they might either judge you or they might relate to you because they know what it's like to be unauthentic, because you're trying to build a community, or you're trying to get more people around, you're trying to get people to like you, and that's what I like about the spiritual community that I am. It's like, like they won't judge you for like cheating on your spouse or for things like that, because like they understand, like, like not to judge and to love unconditionally. But because you're doing the shadow work, you're not just doing a bad thing and then choosing not to reflect upon it. Shadow work is looking at, why did I do this? Why did this happen? How can I improve? What is happening in me that I'm not loving myself, that I'm hurting other people, or why am I projecting on other people? I think that it is possible that people might do something to make themselves less unauthentic in order to please. But here's another thing too. It's like, there's a way of doing it for like being inauthentic so you can please other people, but there's also another thing where it's like you're not being quite inauthentic, but you're holding back a little bit, because like here's the thing too. It's like when you're speaking to an audience, or like you have in a community, you kind of get a feel for where the community is at a consciousness level, like at a level of awareness. Sometimes, the community, and you may not be ready for certain kinds of truth. And that's what happens a lot, like in the spiritual community. Like the mainstream community is mostly has the most ego, because they're the less, because here's the thing, people don't like the truth, they like the airy, they like the love and light kind of thing. That's why I say shadow work is not popular at all, because it is really uncomfortable. So things in the spiritual community would be like, if you're maybe a spiritual influencer, or you have a community, or you're just, this could happen where you're being authentically yourself. There's people that vibe with you, and you might have a community, you might meet other people and you have a bigger community. um but as I was saying, like, like you got to understand, like sometimes there's some things people are not going to be ready to hear yet, and it's not possible to keep your community together because everyone is at different levels. So like sometimes you might have to hold back, sometimes you have to keep things private, and so being authentic doesn't mean like you have to be like totally super honest, give so many details about things. Like within reason, like you also have to keep yourself safe, not be too honest to the point where like it's hurting you, or that people can abuse you, or things like that. Because if you're like, you know what I mean? Like there's a level of, 'cause to make the distinction between like being inauthentic and just holding back. You know what I mean? Like it's not the same thing. Sometimes like you have to use your caution to keep yourself safe rather than choosing to be outright inauthentic. Because like when you're inauthentic, it's going to come at you, it's going to bite you. You're going to make mistakes, but despite whether or not your community just supports you or not, there's always going to be some people that aren't going to like you no matter what. So even if you feel like you have to be inauthentic, like you can't please everyone. I do feel like sometimes people might do that anyway. And that just means that they have something they need to work on themselves. That's another thing with people that are like in the spiritual influencer or things, like these people aren't perfect. And what I see happen a lot is like people in the community will put these influencers on a pedestal, and they think that they're infallible. They think that they're going to do no wrong. Like they automatically think, oh, they're a good person and blah blah. They don't know them. You know what I mean? So like people will also, like, just as we put ourselves in a box with identity, people who don't even know you will think that they know you, and they put you in a box of who you can and cannot be. For instance, like in the spiritual community, if you have a book and you're promoting your book, they think, oh, that person, he's only in it for the money. I hate him, I judge him, he's not a good spiritual person. That happens a lot. If you're spiritual and you're making money, that doesn't work with the paradigm, because in the old, in the spiritual, the big community that doesn't do the shadow work, it's more leaning on the judgment, more with the ego. Like the whole idea is like woke is broke. Like if you're woke, you have to be poor. You can't be rich. You can't, make money, and then things like that. And so like that's another thing that people judge a lot too. It's like, oh, they just assume like, oh, you're just all fake. You're pretending to be spiritual and things like that. But like the thing is that everyone's on their own level. You know, so everyone's on their own level. And people aren't going to be who you think that they are, and you know what I mean. But it's the same thing. It's always shadow projection. I would suggest the best thing for you is to obviously be your authentic self, but also use your caution, because if you're too open, other people can like kind of hurt you a bit, and sometimes it can get really bad, because sometimes people's shadow projection can be really bad, where they want to hunt you down and threaten your family, or kill your family, or they don't want you sharing, what you're saying, and things that happens a lot, especially like in politics with like commentators, even with people like the president. Like we got to protect people from people that want to hurt them, or things like that. It's kind of weird. But ultimately, like when you are your authentic self, you're going to have a really small group. The more authentic you are, like that's what they say, like when you become more authentic and you work on yourself more, your friend circle is going to get very small. you know
Yeah.
so like if you have like a really big community, it is possible that it's like a mixture of like people who generally agree on the same paradigms or agree on the same way of thinking. So like the more popular spiritual community doesn't really go into shadow work. They're more focused on love and light, and the whole woke is broke idea, and things like that. Like, and also they're also, in a weird way, they're kind of prude too in the spiritual community. I don't know why, but it's like you can't talk about anything sexual or whatever. Like they're gonna think you're a weirdo. They're gonna think you're not really spiritual or whatever, or things like that. That also happens a lot in the spiritual community. Is like these things get demonized. Anything having to do with making money gets demonized. You talk about anything sexual, it's demonized. You don't talk about love and light, but you talk about the harsher things like shadow work, that gets demonized. People don't want to hear that. People just want good vibes and things like that, but they're only focused on the light. And that's the thing about shadow work, is like you look at this yin and yang. There's a light for every dark, there's a dark for every light. Everyone has the shadow. And some people, they don't want to deal with that, and that's completely fine, because whatever life path they're on, that is what's serving them in the moment, and that's completely fine.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, shadow work definitely seems like it has a very valuable application for everyone from all walks of life to really be authentic, find out who they are, and there does seem to be I think a bit of a steep drop off between probably our two worldviews, mine and yours, whereas shadow work definitely has a lot of overlaps, as I was saying before. I think
Hmm.
one of the core tenets of my worldview is that I am not the point, and so let me know if if we do depart here, or if we're similar. But core tenet of my worldview would be I'm not the point. So my existence is temporary here on Earth, and that there's an
Hmm.
afterlife for eternity. And so I'm called to be whatever I can be for people here, as helpful as possible, as much pointing them to truth and light as possible here for now. And that might cause me a lot of pain. That might cause me to maybe even be inauthentic, or to prioritize certain things that would hurt my authentic self. But to then have eternity to be authentic. Would you say that there's probably, am I right in identifying like a drop off there between us, or are we still aligned and maybe I don't realize it?
Let me see if I understand it first. Like when you talked about okay, how do I explain it? It's like the way I see like people who are like of influence or trying to share truth or whatever, it's like they're not the point. Like it's not about the person, like they might idol like with Jesus, they might idolize Jesus and like completely forget the point of like what he taught, whatever. It's not about the person. It's like you're being a voice of what other people needed to hear. So it doesn't matter, if you're imperfect, it doesn't matter like if you maybe inauthentic. That's completely normal, and that's something that is embraced in shadow work, you know but it's like you are gathering people. You're being a light to people who need you, essentially.
Yeah, and
And I feel like,
you might
huh?
allow people to step on you, if it helps them, that kind of thing.
mm, I'm actually might have to explain more.
Sure, like case in point, being a youth pastor or just being a counselor to people, there's been times where to be someone's friend was very painful because they were a toxic person. they were they were very harmful, and for all intents and purposes, to better myself, I should have just dropped them like a bad habit, because they were really just a negative energy, a negative space. Just every time I entered in to their space, it was just antagonistic and toxic.
Hmm.
But because I was living a tenet that I'm not the point, that my point is to help whoever
Oh,
is in my circle. I kept entering back into that negative space, to try and help that person. And I've done it quite a lot. Sometimes it pays off. Sometimes it doesn't pay off at all. Sometimes it feels like a complete waste of time. But
okay. I think what you're talking about, like in the spiritual community, there's this idea of give, 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 and not about like how you're feeling, But that's the thing in shadow work is also like self care. That's a very important thing because like you want to help people, you want to be a light to people. Even sometimes you'll do it at your own expense. You might like overdo it to yourself because you're trying to help other people. But that's the thing in the spiritual community. That's like the love and light community that doesn't work with shadow work. Is they're always like you got to give, 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 and it's like you don't get enough of like you got to recharge yourself. You got to take care of yourself too. It comes from a good place of always giving, but there's going to be a drawback where it is going to hurt you. Sometimes it might help people, sometimes it won't. But ultimately, if you're neglecting yourself, like it's because you might have like a paradigm that I'm not allowed to give myself attention. I'm not allowed to take care of myself. I'm not allowed, to not worry about other people and things like that. But sometimes that gets demonized as being selfish, you know but it's actually you self-helping. But it's either way, it's the way you want to do it though. Like it's up to you whether like it's good or bad depending on how you want to see it. You know what I mean? Like that's what I'm saying. It's like there is like no like good or bad, like demonizing this or demonizing that, or saying like what is the best course of action. I mean, that's really up to you to decide. Because like to make that distinction, that would, I don't want to like sound like judgmental by saying this is good, this is bad, but it's like the way I see it is like even bad things can teach us to realize what is good. You know what I mean? Like when I was in my cults, like I didn't realize I was being judgmental. I didn't realize I was projecting my beliefs on other people. I didn't realize I was closed minded, but because I went through that, I realized the difference now. You know what I mean? So, like, I think it's possible for that to happen in any situation, whether you're a religious leader or an influencer or part of a community or not. That can totally happen. But ultimately, it's like it's up to you to decide whether or not, because like no one can tell you how you feel or what your interpretations of things are other than you.
Yeah. Well, I think so. We have a list of questions I want to go through, and I'll introduce those. And I think those will really help kind of bring this home in a great way. Let me just close off this quick little segment. That quick little, but of we're at an hour mark here, and what I want to do is just say, Nova, you've given us a great introduction to shadow work. We're going to step into these 8 worldview questions with you in a moment, and I'll introduce those. And I think those will really help to put an awesome, tie together a nice little bow on, again, just a rough, brief introduction to who you are, what you believe, and the shadow work. But for now, I just want to say thank you for. So if you're here, guys, I'm going to put this segment on YouTube as just a section for shadow work and keep it nice, contained to an hour, so people who wanted an introduction to shadow work can just see an hour-long video, and then I'll clip this part into another video for Nova's worldview. But I highly encourage everyone to watch both. But that being said, let me just close off the shadow work real quick, and then we'll move into these worldview questions. So 1 second here.